Let me welcome all the participants to this webinar. The webinar is the first one of a series of 3 webinars on the policy package that the European Union, the European Commission designed to reduce emissions in Europe. This first one is on the Fit for 55 policy package, and in particular on the carbon pricing mechanism, which is included in the package and which extend the existing emission pricing mechanisms in Europe. But in reality, the Fit for 55 package is much more general, much richer of contents, and we will discuss today even other components, other elements of these very, very important policy measures that the European Commission designed to achieve the minus 55% objective, which is included in the EU climate law. It's a law, and we need to identify the ways in which we can achieve this target. I said that it's the first one of a series. Let me just tell you before forgetting that the next webinar will be on September 13. If you can mark this date on in your calendar at 5:30 p.m. and it will be on the implication of the Russian war and the Russian embargo on climate policies and the measures and the decisions and the difficulties that may arise because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the next one is on September 13th. Now let's focus on this one. When we plan this webinar, there were signals that something was not really going right at the European level. Certainly, we were not expecting several weeks ago the last week decision of the European Parliament not to approve the Fit for 55 package, not yet. And today we will hear about what is coming in the next weeks. But certainly we were not expecting such a negative decision, but there were signals that something was not positive. In particular, there were signals that the extension of the emission pricing mechanism to buildings and transports were not receiving a lot of support from the members of the parliament, from the committees of the European Parliament. And so we thought that it was important to meet today, to gather today, to talk not only about the contents of the Fit for 55 package, but also about the importance of the pricing mechanism, of how this extended carbon pricing mechanism can help reducing emissions in Europe. But now there is also the decision of the Parliament. So we will also talk about the implication of this decision and of the way out. How can we design a way out from these complicated situations, which the majority, the so-called Ursula majority, is unable to support a consensus, an agreement on climate policy in Europe. We will discuss all these issues, and we'll discuss, as I said, also the other components, and let's understand what will remain of the Fit for 55 package after the negotiation inside the Parliament and even outside, because after the approval from the Parliament, the negotiation with member countries will start, and we don't know what at the end we will have and how negative this process can be for climate policies and emission reductions in Europe. We will hear about all this. We will talk about all this with you, with all of you, and in particular, we will start with 3 outstanding speakers. First one, an introduction, a more academic introduction from Adrian Fabre, who is a postdoc in climate economics at ETH in Zurich, and then we will move to more practical consideration from Jos Delbeke, who was at the European Commission for many years and is now climate chair at the School of Transnational Governments in Florence, at European Institute in Florence, and also guest professor in Leuven. And Andrea Tilke, who was also for many years at the European Commission in charge of the climate change unit in DG Research, and is now professor in Trondheim in Norway, and he is also one of the advisors of the Italian Ministry of Sustainable Infrastructure and Mobility. So all these three speakers will have the skills, knowledge, experience, in particular, Jos and Andrea, to tell us what's going to happen in the coming weeks. But let me stop here. Let's start with Adrienne. I'll give you the floor for about 12, 13 minutes, and then we'll have the other speakers and plenty of time at the end for discussion. Thank you all for participating, and in particular, I would like to thank you, Adrienne, Jos, and Andrea. Let's start with Adrienne.
Thank you very much, Carlo. Thank you for the nice introduction, and I'm happy to be here. So first, let me briefly give the case for carbon pricing, although I think everybody knows that already. The idea of carbon pricing is that we make the polluter pay, and by having a uniform price on greenhouse gas emission, we do this in an efficient way, because all emissions that are less costly than the carbon price to abate are incentivized to be abated, and those who are too costly to abate at the given price are not. So this is the economic case in favor of carbon pricing, and the main reason why the European Commission wanted to develop a second emission trading scheme, so the ETS2, that would encompass all emissions from heating and transport fuels, so capping this emission at a level that is consistent with the climate targets of the EU. The cap reduces every year, and the quota at the European level is auctioned, so that fossil fuel companies have to pay the price of their emissions. Then they pass on the cost to consumers, who reduce their consumption because of higher fuel prices. And with the revenues from the ETS2, from the auctions, the idea was to help vulnerable households to face the cost of the transition, and to compensate vulnerable households and help them change their equipment. So in a nutshell, I think that the plan of the European Commission was an efficient, fair and binding way to meet the climate targets of the EU for the transport and heating sector that correspond to 40% of EU emissions. So it's a big deal. Now, there are also some limitations of relying only on a carbon price, mainly due to the fact that some people are constrained to use fossil fuels, and some have lifestyles where they do not use fossil fuels. And even for same level of income, there are huge disparities in the consumption of fossil fuels. And to the extent that we believe it's not to the people's responsibility that there are such big disparities, that is due to historical choices at the society level, that some people need to live in rural areas and take the car, some people can live in city centers and take the bicycle, etc. Then having a higher price on fossil fuels create horizontal inequalities, because those who happen to consume few fossil fuel will not pay a higher price, will not spend more on fossil fuels, and those who happen to live in rural areas, in a house that is heated by fossil fuels, they will have to spend more. So this is a reason why the optimal policy package is not only a carbon price, but also complementary measures that would put perhaps a higher abatement effort on sectors with few disparities, like industry, and lower abatement effort on households. So the thing is that the Green Deal, the Fit for 55 package, had this understanding of the need for a package of complementary measures, and it plans many other measures to tackle greenhouse gas emissions, like stricter standards on new vehicles, like stricter standards on new buildings, reinforcement of the first emission trading system, the current one, and plans for agriculture, plans for maritime and aviation fuels, etc. So we can think of the ETS2 as a way to guarantee that emission would be in line with the climate targets, because this puts a limit, binding cap on the emission of heating and transport. And thanks to complementary measures, the price of emissions on the ETS2 would remain low, so that we will not create huge disparities for a given level of income. Now, the European Parliament was concerned that this ETS2 would still hurt households too much, and with the Renew group, the SND, the Greens, and the Left, they voted for an amendment in the Environmental Committee of the European Parliament that waters down the text completely, because it excludes households from the pricing mechanisms. But households are the bulk of this emission from heating and transport. On top of that, they voted for a price cap of 50 euros per ton of CO2, which is equivalent to 10 cents per liter of gasoline. So it's quite low, and it may not be enough for incentivizing people to reduce their fossil fuel consumption. So in a sense, even before the European Parliament finally voted against the whole text, the version that they were about to vote was watered down and emptied the ETS2 from its substance. And I want to defend the vision of the Commission, because although, as I said, there are reasons to want complementary measures, to not undertake the transition away from fossil fuels for heating and away from combustion engine cars, mainly through carbon pricing, the ETS2 put a binding cap on emission and guarantees that we meet the target. It also encourages government and European legislators to adopt new measures so that the price of carbon on the ETS2 is lower, because we would need less incentives to decrease emission through pricing, because we would have other measures that lowers emissions in other ways. So now the big issue is that without the ETS2, there is no guarantee that the emissions would decrease in line with the objective. And especially given that the European Parliament is probably not going to propose alternative measures that could provide equivalent emission reductions. Yes, I think I can conclude now by summarizing what I said, that we need this ETS2 to give a limit that guarantees emission reduction, and perhaps to compromise and accept the concerns of the European deputies, member of parliament. What we could do is delay the entering of the ETS2 into application, what was already proposed in the amendments, actually, so that, and at the same time to front load the social climate fund which is the fund that is planned to be used to help vulnerable households undertake the transition. So by providing vulnerable households with means to change their fossil fuel equipment in advance, and by making sure that the price of carbon will hit at some point and more, then we give people 5-10 years to make the change of equipment needed, and we keep the incentives after 5 or 10 years, and with an increase in carbon tax or price that pushes households to change their equipment in the first place.
Thank you for this initial introduction. Of course, this mechanism, as you described, is complemented, the ETS2, the extension of the ETS is complemented by measures that should make it easy to accept it. The consensus is crucial, and the social fund is one of these measures. But we will hear more on this from Jos Delbeke. As I told you before, he's professor at the European University in Florida. He has the EIB climate chair, but he's also the former director general of the DG on climate action, the European Commission. So he has all the information, the experience to tell us about what's the future for the Fit for 55, and in particular for ETS2. The concern is that ETS2 is putting a burden which is excessive on European households because the price to achieve the target will be too high, even though studies on this particular matter are really limited. We don't have enough good research, and this is a call for action on economists to do more on this matter. But Jos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlo. And I would like to sketch out a little bit where we are in the politics, because the European Parliament failed to adopt a position on the ETS1, the ETS2, and the CBAM, the border tariff. And precious time may be lost. I hope it is not going to be lost, because I'm worried about the impact, the political and the impact on the package of the war in Ukraine. And I think that's a very important element we also have to consider. Let me make 5 points. The first is that nobody, thanks God, nobody has put into question the overall target by 2030, 55% reduction based on 1990. So that is put in the climate law. And so the only thing we are discussing are modalities, how to get there. So let's not overly dramatize what we are doing. But of course, it's a package of measures. And if you do more on the one, you can afford doing less on the other, or vice versa. If you do less on ETS2 compared to what the Commission proposed, you will have to do more on another measure. Now, what was proposed in the European Parliament, that is under the ETS, that we would have a stricter proposal compared to what the Commission was advancing. The Commission proposed 61% below 2005, and the Greens and the Socialists in the European Parliament wanted to go to 67%, which was then toppled down to 63%, but was giving rise to a lot of uneasiness. But the fact is, it was stricter than the European Commission proposal and is still in line with the 55%. On the ETS2, as Adrien was indicating, that we have a kind of a proposed delay. It would only be on commercial buildings. But I'm going to come back in a minute on that, because the ETS2 is in an environment where there is already a lot of other legislation on cars, legislation on fuels, on energy taxes. So it's stopping up that kind of legislation. And the third element that was delayed was the CBAM, the border tariff, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, that is somewhat delayed, but in particular under the CBAM, whether there is a border tariff, the amount of free allocation would go down. And that was the issue of debate. How fast shall it go down? So that's the context of the debate. And so I would like to make a comment on the ETS, the normal ETS, before I come to the ETS2. On the normal ETS, what was proposed was to accelerate the emission reduction compared to what the Commission proposed. Now, when we look back under the ETS, what was the success of the ETS? It is the switching away from coal towards gas. The fuel switching was very important and was accelerated after the prices went up when the market stability reserve was agreed from 30 to 60 euros per ton. We had a very active fuel switching from coal to gas. But now we are in a situation of war. The natural gas as a fuel switching possibility has gone. It's no longer there. And so reports are indicating that the price level, the carbon price level that we need for fuel switching may well be way beyond 200 euros per ton of carbon. Now, the price today is around 80, 82, 85, but that's already very high compared to where we were. You know, 5 years ago, we had not exceeded the 10 euros. Now we have a price level 10 times that level. But to have the fuel switching working in the situation of natural gas that is very expensive, we need a price of more than 200 euros per ton, according to some 250 euros per ton. Now, I pretend that in the current economic circumstances, that's challenging politically, because there is an impact on electricity prices. It's going to be hotly debated. And I think we should refrain from doing more now under the ETS, but level out the effort at least that we, according to the proposal by the Greens and the Socialists, it's to do more now and less later before 2030. But I would say, let's do the opposite, because now we have a war, now we have a problematic situation, now we should do somewhat less and do more at the end of the period without putting into question the 55% and the 61% based on 2005 that was proposed. So it's the modality on when do you do what. And another element that the Commission has been proposing is, and that's very new to the ETS, to use part of the revenues from the ETS, because with the current prices, the ETS is really a cash cow. And the Commission, in its Repower communication, proposed to take 20 billion euros, approximately 250 million allowances, out of the market stability reserve to kickstart investments in alternatives to natural gas. And I think that's a very clever move, because if the price impact is not working, because the fuel switching is not working, let's start through using the revenues in a strategic way. And by the way, by doing that, it moderates the price increase on the ETS1. So my point on the ETS1 is be cautious. Let's not do everything now overnight, but rather schedule it out over the period, because there is a situation of war, prices are high, and let's moderate the price increase and let's use the revenues to get where we want to get. So that was my second point. My third point on the ETS2 is I fully agree it's strategically important to widen the application of the carbon price. So also for heating fuels, also for transport fuels. But watch out, for transport fuels, we already pay a lot of excise duties. And there is a parallel proposal by the Commission on energy taxation. So let's see what is happening there before we jump for an additional carbon price. I'm fully in favor of it, but the two need to be looked at together. For heating fuels, the situation is different, because natural gas was hardly taxed in many countries, and there was a huge disparity between taxing electricity compared to taxing gas. So we have to be considered, but again, natural gas is falling away as an alternative because, because of the war in Ukraine, we have to move away from natural gas. So where are we going to switching to? So we have to switch to heat pumps, to hydrogen and all this kind of very expensive solutions. So the question is this ETS2 in principle very good, but are the current energy prices on the market, are not doing the job? Prices for gas are very high. Prices at the pump are very high. So I think it's very logical to postpone a little bit the start of the ETS2. So let's not overly dramatize in the short term if we are sure that over time the carbon price is also going to cover transport fuels and heating fuels. But current energy prices and the crisis we are in are already doing part of the job. That was my third point. My fourth point is on the Social Climate Fund. Of course, absolutely important. The risk we have is that people look at climate policy as a policy for the middle class, in which those falling into the fuel poverty trap are not capable of paying up for the carbon and making alternative investments in energy efficiency and renewables, etc., etc. So the Social Climate Fund is absolutely important to carry perhaps 25, a quarter or a third of the population that is really facing difficulties in the current context of high energy prices. So we must address the distributive issue. We must address also the reskilling of workers, because a lot of workers have to get away from natural gas boilers towards the management of heat pumps, completely different technology. So retraining of workers is really a bottleneck. Also in the construction sector, having energy efficiency for homes is a very sophisticated job. It's no longer the rough and dirty construction facilities. It has to be very well done. So reskilling of workers, I think, is very important. So my fourth point is the Social Climate Fund is absolutely important, but the Commission has not been very clear what it wants to do with the Social Climate Fund. It has an envelope of money, but it is not teasing out those people who are really involved in what could be done and what should be done, support for the renovation of houses, the heat pumps, the electric vehicles. All these new technologies are relatively expensive, let's face it, and are not affordable for a quite important share of our population. And my last point, my fifth point I wanted to make is that I'm very worried about one of the amendments that were approved in the European Parliament to limit the role of financial intermediaries in the carbon market. There would be controls on the permit, the amount of certificates that are held by one or the other financial intermediary. And that is very risky because we need hedging. We need the services that the financial market is bringing to the market. But again, given the high carbon prices, you know, in some member states, not least in Poland, they are saying, the carbon market is subject to illegal speculation. And we see speculation on the market more than a reduction of emissions. And that is another, another translation, how people are nervous about the high carbon prices that we are currently seeing. And we should take that as a signal that we cannot easily talk about carbon prices of 150, 250, 300 euros. And I think Adria has been publishing, a number of articles on these high price levels. I would say, no, if we would have today a carbon price of 250, 300 euros, economists may prefer that, but the political, psychological limit is there, and politicians would be put under pressure to perhaps stop the carbon market, to put, a cap on the carbon market, and that would be the worst of all. So I would rather plead for moderation, keep the system intact, not restrict the role of financial intermediaries, but to go for a moderate solution and use the revenues from the carbon market. So as a conclusion, I think it's a missed opportunity that the European Parliament could not agree. But, let's try again. But let's be moderate. The best is the enemy of the good. If we want to do everything now overnight, we may bring ourselves in trouble because there is a war, there is upheaval on energy markets, and this upheaval on energy markets is not hopefully going to take us beyond 2027, 28, 29. So if we would spread out the emission reduction effort equally over the period, we would have done a good job. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jos. Very, very interesting, very important. And I fully agree with you that at least we need some clear ideas on what to do on the social fund, on the relationship between the existing taxation, excise duties, and the forthcoming ETS2, in particular on transport. There are many things that need some additional work, and I believe that this what happened is probably a positive step towards a better design and a clarification on many issues inside the Fit for 55 package. But let's have Andrea Tilke's opinion on all this. Andrea was, as I told you before, the head of the climate change unit at DG Research, and is now struggling in Italy at the Ministry of Infrastructure and Mobility to achieve some of the objectives of the Fit for 55 package, and struggling in particular with the other ministries that have very different views. So, Andrea, the floor is yours, and tell us not only what's your own experience, but how you see the situation that has been created. How can we do with or without the ETS2 to achieve the climate objective?
Thank you, Carlo. And I have heard very wise words from the outstanding speakers that spoke before me. Very wise. I guess that we have to be very careful in this moment. It's a difficult moment. It's a difficult situation. Some of the Ukraine war and the political difficulties in some countries have to be very well taken into account. I'm quite sure that the move of some of the members of the parliament to propose some watering down amendments was in some way linked to the fear of having a new wave of populism in Europe. You have to remember that it was due to the little carbon tax on diesel that the yellow jacket movement started some years ago. So it is something that we have to consider very carefully. And the fact of finding ways to front-loading the European Social Climate Fund might be important, but it's more important to try to change the narrative, because the right wing or the populist movements are using any argument about a new kind of taxations as something so to go against. What is sane in this kind of proposal of the ETS and so on, it is that it is functional for obtaining a scope, and it's a completely different way of it's a fiscal policy, but it's not. It is dedicated to achieving a goal. Now, the ETS sector, by the way, it has shown in the years from the time that when it became active to now, to be a very effective measure to reach the goal of decarbonization. While the non-ETS sectors, I have to say that they were much less. So the amount of emission decreases that we have seen have been variable and not constant. And sometimes the overall decrease of emissions in non-ETS sectors were even more due to other causes. For instance, the 2008 financial crisis or the recent pandemic and the lockdown. So it's we have seen not as enough everywhere in Europe the application of climate policies, of national climate policies in the non-ETS sectors. So there are only very few countries in Europe that have, in addition to the ETS, a carbon price, a national carbon price. This is not a standard everywhere. So the good thing of the ETS system is that, as Adrian said, it is predictive. You can, when you set the curve, you will obtain the goal. The point is that if this is not applied, and if it is very much watered down, how can we achieve the 2030 targets? And without the ETS, without the ETS too. And I have tried to think a little bit about this in terms of which are the space of regulations, of national regulations that may help in decreasing emissions in the transport sector and in the building sector. Let's start from the transport sector. And I take Italy as an example because we have, together with Carlo and another group of people, we have worked on a recent report where we have looked at that. But in Italy, we have today higher transport emissions with respect to 2005. We have 3.5% more emissions than in 2005. So the ESR did not work at all in the transport sector. So how, in order to be able to achieve the goal at 2030, we have to act with very important policies. I would say that it would even be necessary to anticipate the phasing out of the internal combustion engines, and you can understand how difficult this could be in a country already where there is national industry dedicated a lot to the internal combustion engines. And then, so I don't think that adopting additional measures of this kind can be really possible. The strong reduction of electric energy prices would be necessary, as Jos has said, because we have to increase the differential with liquid fuels, and this might be a way to put pressure for a change towards electric cars. But this is again not an easy issue, because it would, in some way, until we have a mechanism of price formation that is so much based on gas, this is not easy. It's not easy at all. We have to remove a lot of taxation and to shift a lot of taxation that is today on electric energy into other things. But fossil fuels for transport have already been charged a lot with taxation, with excise. And therefore, it is not very feasible today in the short term. So these shifts have to take place over a long time, and not from today and tomorrow. This is not something that can be absorbed easily if it's applied from one day to the next. We have other measures that may be, but usually these measures are very much locally decided, like reducing the private circulation in the city centers, but more to impose more. So this might lead to decisions in shifting to public transport and so on. But again, this is a difficult measure because it's not so popular, first of all, and then there is another problem, because if congestion is the problem is to remove traffic. But if the goal is to move from fossil fuel to electricity, this is another story. This other point is how to push for street mobility measures. And again, this can be, for instance, also acted through fiscal policies, because there are circulation taxes in every country, and these circulation taxes have to be based on emissions today. And this is not the standard everywhere. And if this, however, if changing this system is left to the nation, to the single countries, changing this may lead to different differences that are not easy to match. In the building sector, again, there are objective difficulties in imposing specific measures. Because, for instance, I guess that it would be important to put an end date, not only to internal combustion engines, but also to gas-fired boilers for homes, and the switch to heat pumps. What can be a way out, however, and there are similarities to the switching from gas boilers to heat pumps, and the switch from internal combustion engine cars and battery electric vehicles, is that the new technologies cost more, of course, but they have a much lower cost of management and much lower operational cost in time. This might be a solution, because with an overall lower, in average, lower total cost of ownership of these technologies, we might conceive measures to add that can be added and should be added to ETS2 to the ETS2, but even without ETS2, they should be established in order to support household loans for households that want to change. And this can be in part taken from the ETS fund, from the social climate fund, and it might be an important driver, but implies different, a change also in mentality, in behaviors, because there are countries that and households that tend very much to save money and not to take investment decisions based on long-term costs. So there are other possibilities, for instance, to put a minimum energy efficiency class for allowing a property to be sold. But again, also this is maybe a quite unpopular system. So in my view, the ETS2 is something that could be the least problematic approach, also from a viewpoint of the political risks of growing protests and populist movements, because with the use of and with the recycling of this social fund, with appropriate recycling, we can anticipate and pay back and compensate the inequalities that may be generated. The problem, as Jos said, is that the Commission proposal is not clear on that. And this is definitely to be worked out better. It tends to be worked out better also because, also in terms of the inequality adjustment that the recycling can provide. You probably have seen this work that was of the IEP that has been issued some time ago, where it's more or less as you said, that the risk is to have a climate policy as a policy for the middle class, because we have maybe 50% of the population that does not pay so much, and 50% that really pay a lot. And the recycling has to be very strong towards the less well-off. So what can we do? Ways to, let's look into the positive matter. The decision taken by the European Parliament at the end is not so dramatic. It would have been more dramatic if a completed watered down package would have been released. So the point of returning the discussion to the Commission, it's maybe good. However, we have to use so the experts and researchers and those who have who study these issues have to open a dialogue with policymakers and have to engage with policymakers very much in order to and maybe have to engage as well with the Commission in order to suggest actions from the Commission side in order to propose and to open up possibilities for a more appropriate distribution of efforts among member states, or for an opening towards measures that may lead to keeping the ETS2 proposal safe.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you also for being right on time. We have 40 minutes for discussion. We'll ask the audience to write their own questions in the question and answer section or in the chat in order for me to see the questions and then ask the three speakers to reply. I got a request from Edmond Alphandéry, the former finance minister of France, to intervene and make a comment. I don't know whether this is possible, but I'm asking the organizer. But if it is, I would like to give Mr. Alphandéry the floor. Is it possible? Maybe not. Well, let's see what's going to happen. I'll ask the CEPR organization to check whether this is feasible. In the meanwhile, I would like to ask you two basic questions from Kathleen McTeague. One is about inflation. How do we expect private citizens to pay these taxes in the face of 8% inflation, even though the ETS2 will enter into force in 2026? So there is time for inflation to vanish, but still there is this issue of the relationship between the price increase of energy induced by these mechanisms, the additional taxes to be paid through these mechanisms, and the possible impacts on inflation. How can we stay on target and manage expectation without losing momentum? That's the Kathleen's questions, which is close also to the questions by Emery Corey. They say, how can we prevent a gilet jaune effect? How can we prevent a loss of consensus, in particular by governments who need to implement these measures at the national level and may lose support, lose consensus because of the gilet jaune effect of these policies, because citizens don't understand why we are doing all this, and they perceive just the short-term cost of these measures. let's answer this one first, and then we will move to the next one. So who would like to start?
I can.
Okay, go. Adrian.
Okay, then so I'll try to answer all the questions, including one from Jack Zedla in the chat. So first, so I studied myself people's attitudes. I started by studying people's attitudes in France during the Yellow Vest movement. And right now I'm conducting a survey in 20 countries all over the world to understand what policies people support, what climate policies they support, and why. And from what I've learned, I think people misinterpret what the Yellow Vests were about. People think that the Yellow Vests protested against carbon tax, which factually is true, right? It was triggered by rising fuel prices, and this was the motive for the first protest in 2018. But the Yellow Vests didn't stop when Emmanuel Macron announced that they will freeze the carbon tax at its current level. It means that the motivation of the Yellow Vests was broader. They were protesting for more purchasing power and for more democratic institutions in France and against the elite. And we also see that in our survey. So people in all countries are extremely opposed to the same type of carbon tax that was introduced in France, where the revenues were kept in the general budget. And coincidentally, the government repealed the wealth tax. But yeah, so the carbon tax introduced by the French government was regressive. Poor households were paying more in proportion of their income. But what is proposed by the Commission in the ETS2 is actually progressive, because the Social Climate Fund would ensure that vulnerable households are compensated and are helped to change their equipment. And these types of revenue use, with this type of revenue use, there is a majority support for carbon tax. This is what we see in the surveys. So I would be more concerned with a green vest if in 2030, the European Union misses its climate targets, which is possible now that that the ETS2 is given up, and you know, people are really do want ambitious climate action and would protest if we don't have it. Now, answering the other questions, how will citizens pay the price facing inflation? Keep in mind that the ETS2 would enter into force not before 2026 from the Commission's proposal, but could be even postponed by 2 or 3 more years. So hopefully we won't have such high inflation by then. Also, to answer Jack Delplat question and comments about the Social Climate Fund, I think it is well defined by the European Commission. So the idea is that 75% of the revenues of the ETS2 would accrue directly to the member states where the emissions are done, and 25% go to the Social Climate Fund. Then this 25% is allocated to member states according to a complicated formula. But if you do the math, you notice that this formula ensures an equal right to emit per capita through the European Union. So in a sense, it's a way to redistribute money from rich European countries to poor European countries. And without the ETS2, without the Social Climate Fund, we would lose this equitable burden sharing of the efforts. And why do I say it's well defined? Because each member state has to come up with a plan to protect vulnerable households and help them change their equipment. And only if they propose a consistent plan will the fund from the Social Climate Fund be given to them, and they will have to match this fund with their own income, which would ensure that overall all the revenues from the ETS2 would be used in a progressive way. And to answer a last point by Kathleen about what about the world? Well, I think this is actually the missing point in the plan from the European Commission is to try to negotiate a global treaty. Here, the US will be the bottleneck but I think rich countries, and I'm not the only one to think that. Also, what we see in the survey is that people vastly agree with that high-income countries need to help low-income countries finance the transition. And we would need to propose this in an international treaty, for example, by proposing African countries or all countries in the world who want to join the European ETS or ETS2 and provide them with free permits in proportion to their population. That would ensure redistribution from high income to low income countries and help solve this global issue.
Well, thank you, Andrea. We'll come back on the international dimension in a minute. Let's have from Jos and Andrea their own view on the issue of the Gilets jaunes effect, the relation with inflation, the social dimension of this policy, and how we can reconcile the climate target with the short-term living condition difficulties that we face in Europe.
Well, thank you very much. And I would like to make the argument on the Gilets jaunes as it was made by Adrian. And for the sake of the discussion, I would like to slightly disagree with what Adrian said in the following sense. I think that the people, the man, the woman in the street, do not care about whether the price increase comes from the war in Russia, from the carbon market, or from any other policy. They are just reacting on the fact that the price at the pump, is going up, and they are less sophisticated. Now, I think also we have to admit that every policy, including the energy transition, is going to have inflationary impacts, because we are going to encourage some things and discourage some other things. And the net effect may be that the transition is going to happen. So given these circumstances, what should we do? I think where I'm very worried is that the energy prices that we are currently seeing today, predominantly due to the upheaval on energy markets and the war in Ukraine, is going to be neutralized by horizontal policy decisions, where all the incentives, also the positive ones that come out of this higher energy prices, are going to be neutralized. I see governments reducing VAT rates. I see governments reducing excise duties at the pump. I see governments capping the electricity prices. I think these are horizontal measures that are not rational in the current context. What we should do instead is to focus and alleviate the effort of those who are in need, those falling into the poverty trap, and have these reductions of taxes just for them and not for the whole society. I mean, I think the energy transition will have to be made direct, will have to be paid for, in one way or the other by the higher income classes. I mean, they have to pay for it and they can afford for that. I do not see that people are today driving less yet or driving smaller cars. I mean, people are just taking the brunt, and that's the way it should be. Through the war in Ukraine or through our climate policies, energy is going to be more expensive, and we have to face up to that reality. But for the social impact, those who have no means to refurbish their houses, to have to have transport that is catered for in rural areas where people are relying on an old diesel car, etc., we have to face up to that reality that is part of life. But it is not by addressing politically those realities that we have to relieve the taxation and the energy price pressure for those who can afford it. So my biggest worry today is that we have too many horizontal policy interventions in the energy market that are benefiting too many people instead of those who really are in need. To put it even stronger, you could even say that the impact of the ETS2 is today being realized through the high energy prices that we are having. The drama is that the revenues go to Russia and to the major oil players, But the incentive for energy efficiency, the incentive for making savings on energy are coming through the price. The point is, as it is not through policy, we are not able to recycle those revenues internally in the European society. So the Gilets jaunes question is very complicated politically, but let's face the problem where it lies, and let's not go for horizontal measures that risk killing all positive incentives that are also very necessary today, and in the end, maybe more important than what is currently being proposed on the ETS2.
Thank you, Jos. Andrea, do you have a comment on all this?
Well, very little comment, because what I heard is wise as before. And the point is that I am very scared of because it's true that, as Adrian said, that the reasons behind the Gilets jaunes movement are broader and are more also France specific, but it's not fully true in the sense that I feel that there are political parties that are ready to put fire on every possibility of they find in terms of creating instability. And now we have a big risk as well, because some of these parties are even connected in some way with what is happening in Russia, and they have links. I see some geopolitical problems being generated by the fact itself that Europe has taken the lead in moving towards climate neutrality. And this is something that is creating by itself a problem. And part of the Ukraine invasion may even be connected in some way to our political decisions towards the climate. So I would stay very, very attentive on how we move and how we have to work very much more on the narrative and on the translation of the policies for the general public. Because it is true that mostly people look at this, what they spend, what is the outcome, what they remain at the end of the month. And if they have gaps, they don't care if the tax that has been applied, it goes into the general funds or it is used for a scope. This is not very...
Andrea, I'm asking another question. You will start first this time. This is coming from Sambo Filainen. It's an easy one if you have a crystal ball. What's going to happen next? Well, after the decision, the European, what do you expect to be next outcome of the negotiations in Brussels? Next decisions?
Maybe Jos is more...
Is closer to the Brussels negotiation. Jos, what do you think?
Well, I think it's a question of how serious the European Parliament is in making its decision, because if it comes too late, it's going to be overruled by the European Council. And I think to some extent they were not making things easy for themselves by not going for a deal now. They may lose precious time. If they can remediate the situation in the next 2-3 weeks, that's going to be fine. But are they going to be able to do that? I don't know. But in any case, the Parliament needs to sum up its position. The Council is about to make and sum up its position. And if the negotiations would go through, without the European Parliament able to agree to anything, then the influence of the European Parliament is going to be seriously undermined. And I think that is a wake-up call for the institution as such. And I think that, as I tried to indicate, the tendency to do much more compared to the Commission proposal in the immediate future runs counter to the reality that in the immediate future we are facing up to a war in Ukraine and upheaval in energy markets. So I think it's better to level out the effort over the entire period instead of trying to do everything overnight, exactly on the moment that we have a war in Ukraine. But I see that Edmond Alfandery has the hand up.
Yeah, and right, exactly. So if we are able to get Mr. Alfandery, it would be nice to have his view on this in this political dimension. Indeed, he has both roles, the political one and the business one, because in his career he has been both. So if we can have Edmond Alfandery and let him speak.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the floor, and thank you for this excellent discussion. As you know, I have created, and Jos knows it better than anyone, because we had this discussion before the COP21, he remembers, in his office. I am very much in favor of the price of carbon. And I think that the price of carbon is probably the best incentive, and you share my view, obviously. In the long run, not in the short run as we see it actually. And this is the dilemma. And this is a very big difficulty. And the second difficulty is that when you increase the price of carbon and you want to make it efficient, then that might have some social impact, as we saw it in the Gilets jaunes upheaval. So coming from that point, I should say that I think that ETS2 is much more complicated than ETS1, because ETS2 is supposed to have an impact on the behaviors of the people, direct behaviors on the people themselves. And you need to have a price of an increase in the price of carbon, which is high and which has social impacts, because as we know, the most affected are I should say the less wealthy people, or the poorest people, if you prefer. And so I think that what is important actually is to succeed at ETS1, at the ETS as it has been launched in 2005. And actually, I think that the price of carbon has increased very much, and that's a good thing, even though I think that probably the past should have been a little bit less high. But anyhow, it's a success. And I think that we should not give signals that weaken ETS1. And I come to REPowerEU and to the decision of the European Commission, or to the proposal of decision, because it is still under discussion, of putting on the market of the reserve stability, the market stability reserve, 250 million tons of CO2. And saying that it will bring resources to fund renewables. Obviously, everything which pushes renewables is good, but also because in this present state of the energy crisis, it is something useful to push fossil fuel and mainly coal. And it appears, in my view, as a major mistake, because the signal given in the fight against climate change is the contrary to the signal we have to give. Why? Because in the ETS, what is the objective of the ETS? As Jos explained, it is obviously to succeed in reducing by 55% the emissions of carbon. But if we want to succeed the energy transition, the price of carbon, a significant price of carbon in the long run, is the best signal if we want to succeed, for example, in hydrogen, if we want to succeed in pushing, in making the substitution between fossil fuel and renewables efficient. And that, in my view, and when you say to the people, and the NGO, by the way, saw that very clearly when you look at their reactions, many of them, WWF and many others. When you say to the people, okay, there is an energy crisis, we need to strengthen the energy production in the European Union. So we need coal today. And so we will put on the market more emission permits. And so what is the transmission mechanism? The price of carbon, the price of carbon. And that is extremely dangerous because it is exactly contrary to what has to be done. What has to be done is to show in the long run that there is an objective in terms of price of carbon, and that the European Commission will do what is necessary in order for this objective to be attained in the long run, not in the short run. In the short run, much more complicated, as we see lately with the energy crisis. And so my suggestion is, and I am speaking to the European Commission today, and I hope I will be convinced. I will be listened to. My point is that inside the functioning of the ETS, we should not only target the quantities, but we should introduce a signal, which is the price of carbon in the long run. In the long run. For example, to say that the price of carbon won't be below 100 euro per ton in 2030, that's very easy to attain, and it will be above 100 euros in 2030. It cannot be below, but it will help very, very much in the energy transition. And in the meantime, you can have a movement in the price of carbon. And my guess is that the fact that you use the market stabilizer, even increase the supply of emission permits, and as expected by the decision in REPower, is not something that has to be condemned. It can be used, but anyhow, you know where you show the people that invest in the long run that anyhow they will lose. They will not lose anything in their investments and their returns because the price of carbon will have a floor of something which is very realistic of 100 euro per ton in 2030. And I remind you that some firms, even those most concerned by the energy transition and that are in the oil and gas industry, have an internal price of carbon of like Total Energy, to say one of them, of 100 euro per ton in 2030. They use it as something they for their decision in terms of investments. So this I will stop there because I think that I don't want to take too much of your time, but I think that we should all together first agree that the price of carbon is very important in the long run, and that we should convince the European Commission to put in place and to say very clearly that the price of carbon, even though it can fluctuate, will have a floor. And since they have the control over the supply, the permit emissions in the hands of the European Commission, there will be very it will be very easy for them to convince those who make the investment, the firms, that they can go towards the energy transition without any risk. Because actually, if the price of carbon, as it happened, and Jos knows that very well, after the great financial crisis, when the price of carbon before the great financial crisis was 30, 35 euro per ton. It fell down, it lost 80%, 90% of its value during 7 or 8 years. And then it lost its impact on the investment in the long run. And that's, in my view, very detrimental to the fight against climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You raised an important point that we discussed many times with Jos about the governance of the ETS markets now, because there are more than one. But Jos, I will let you reply briefly and then move to the other questions.
Well, thank you, Carlo. And a brief reaction to what Edmond Lafaznerie just developed. And I fully agree with the importance of the long-term price signal. And if a floor can be made there, I think fully in agreement. In fact, the Market Stability Reserve is de facto the floor. And we have seen that with the COVID crisis. When the COVID crisis broke out, prices were falling, and they were not falling as deep as one would have expected, thanks to the functioning of the Market Stability Reserve. But I wanted to reassure Edmond for one element, and that is that the 250 million allowances that the Commission tries to bring to the market is within the target of 2030. It is not changing at all the target for 2030. It is just shifting a little bit less in the beginning and a little bit more at the end of the period. But the overall target stays untouched and is not affecting the environmental credibility of the ETS. I think that's a very important point. And it gives the resources on the side that may help investors to kickstart the investments they are needed to make in CCS or in hydrogen or in other rather expensive solutions. So fully in agreement with Edmond, except for one little thing, that the 250 million allowances brought to the market by the Commission is not touching the long-term viability or even the short-term objective for 2030. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. I would like to move to another set of questions concerning the international dimension of the climate change problem, because many participants argue that decisions in Europe, and in particular, decision to reduce emissions in Europe may be irrelevant if the other countries don't adopt similar measures on carbon pricing or the measure to reduce emissions, both in developed and in developing countries. So I would like to ask maybe Adrien and Andrea to argue. Adrien said something a little bit on this before, on how to let developing countries to be connected, linked to ETS, but I would like to go deeper into this discussion, because indeed all the effort in Europe may be completely jeopardized by the increase of emissions in other countries. Adrien, Andrea?
Yes, I mean, I will be short because I already mentioned this. I think it's still worth it to go for carbon neutrality in Europe by 2050, even if the other countries are not as fast, because it showcases that it is possible to build a carbon neutral economy. And by doing that, we even may get an advantage in the economy of the 21st century, because we'll grow companies that will build the necessary technologies. That being said, I think the European Union is not doing enough on trying to get an international agreement. I am aware that it's not possible currently, given that the US Senate doesn't have a pro-climate majority. But I think the EU is not doing enough to bring low-income countries to the table. And the demand of low-income countries has been the same for 30 years. We are willing to decarbonize if high-income countries help us. And I think we should accept that.
Andrea?
Yeah, well, I definitely agree that the question if being a front runner is not too much a risk, I would say that it's not, considering the fact that we are a very advanced part of the world, and we can make this a benefit for us instead of a risk. I see more. Moreover, and the Ukraine situation and the Russian invasion shows better than nothing than before, that we have to achieve a higher level of energy independence, which is basilar. It's our weakness. Our weakness was the dependency on other countries on energy. We have to go out from that, definitely, very much as we can, not become isolated, because this will not the case. Most probably we will need for chemicals, for hydrogen, for other e-fuels and things like that, productions that come from elsewhere. But we don't have to make the errors that we have made in the past, to put ourselves in the hands of countries which are not reliable and that are non-democratic and so on. So we have to use that. We had a huge possibility some years ago. I remember an interesting geopolitical discussion saying, well, China is becoming the world goods producer, the US is the IT system, what we should be. And there was an interesting proposal that we could be the environmental engineers of the world. And in some way, this has realized in some way. And it's not well, it was, and it is consistent with a very steep increase of these markets and the role that we can play there. On top of that, we have to add that the current crisis of globalization will change many other things in the future. We have to be ready to some reshoring of what has been outsourced today, is outsourced to China or to other countries. We have to redesign our relationships with everyone in the world. And we have to establish much more connections with, and also have the look at Africa as a continent that has a huge demographic potential and where growth will concentrate in the future. If we will help and with our 10-15, today we have an economic dimension which is around 10% of world, but we count more for international trade. And if anybody wants to trade with, for anybody selling products around, we are a very important customer. Therefore, what we decide is definitely still making creating a standard. So I am particularly preoccupied on the tendency to water down the CBAM because CBAM was very important for this, for give the signal that we are not willing to be dumped by other countries if other countries don't want to follow us in the climate policy.
Okay, thank you. But at the same time, we can say that the Fit for 55 package could have been more effective if coupled with a package to collaborate, to work with other countries in driving their own climate policy, in particular with developing countries, something that I don't see coming from the European Commission. But maybe I'm wrong. Joss, what do you think about the international policy of the European Commission?
Well, thank you. And I wholeheartedly agree with Andrea that we are in urgent need for a comprehensive geopolitical strategy related to the energy and climate transition. we have only seen the beginning, and the CBAM is the early beginning. But now with the war in Ukraine, the scarcity of the raw materials that we need, let alone, of course, the energy that we are no longer buying from Russia in a while, you know, changes the landscape totally. And let me repeat what I said at the beginning, the fact that the fuel switching from coal to gas has come to an end. That has changed the landscape tremendously for our climate policy. We have now to go to energy efficiency, to renewables, to carbon capture and storage, to hydrogen, etc. All things where the marginal cost of abatement is much higher compared to the switch from coal to gas. And so the geopolitical strategy is urgently needed. We talk about strategic autonomy, but we cannot do everything on our own in Europe. We need to have good links with the world at large, not least with Africa, as Andrea was indicating, the Middle East, but also countries like Egypt, Algeria, you know, Tunisia, you know, countries we were hardly talking about in the past, but now they come squarely in the middle of the political attention. So I think we should work on that. We have, with the CBAM, we are only at the beginning of that new chapter of the international dimension of the climate and energy transition.
Right, in particular because CBAM is just a stick. Probably we need many carrots as well, not a stick only.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's 7 p.m. and it's the end of this webinar. There are other questions, but I think that you can all read the questions and react privately to the other ones. I would like to thank all participants, and your active participation has been very useful for the success of the seminar. And I would like to thank the three speakers, all the comments, your ideas, I believe are very useful and will be useful for those involved in the policy process, both in Brussels and at the national level. So thank you very much. Don't forget to attend next webinar on September 13 on the implications of the Russian embargo and the Russian war. Thank you all and have a nice evening. Bye.
Thank you very much, Carlo.
Thank you again. Bye.